Socrates said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." I think you'll agree that there are some questions that are worthy of our time and consideration. For example, why am I here? Is there a purpose to my life? Do I have intrinsic value? The way we answer these questions will affect the way we view and treat the world. And because we're part of the world, they will affect the way we view and treat ourselves. I remember Dad telling me one time about a Bible study he had years ago with a young man and his sister. He was over at their house, they were sitting around the kitchen table studying, and the mother of the siblings was kind of hovering around, listening in. Finally, she said, "Can I ask a question?" And Dad said, "Of course." She said, "Why did God create anything at all?" Well, what a great question. Now, Dad later found out she was a philosophy professor at one of the local universities. But why did God create anything at all? And does the Bible answer this question? We're going to look at 3 different things in our discussion, and I believe when we put them all together, they will have a very powerful impact on the answer to that question. First of all, God created because He wanted to. Now, this may seem like an overly simplistic answer, but listen to what John said in Revelation chapter 4 and verse 11 as he records the heavenly chorus before the throne room of God. They said, "Worthy is the Lord our God to receive glory and honor and power, for He created all things, and by His will they were created and exist." By His will. God willed to create you and me. He was not coerced. He did not create out of necessity. He did not need to create us. He wanted to create us. Number 2, if we go back to Genesis chapter 1, we remember that over and over again there is this pattern of God noting that what He'd made was good, and finally it was very good. Now, this idea of goodness goes beyond simply the moral idea of being beyond decay or without corruption. When God looked at His creation and said, "It is good," He was delighting in what He had made. You and I were created for God's own pleasure. Now, third, if we go back to Psalm 19 and verse 1, a passage we've mentioned before, the heavens were created to glorify God. And not just the heavens, we were all created. All things were created to glorify God. In fact, Paul wrote in Colossians 1 and verse 16 that all things were made by Him and for Him. We were made, like the heavens, for God. God, according to Psalm 115 and verse 3, sits in heaven and does all that pleases Him. God wanted to create us for His good pleasure and for His glory. Now that brings up an interesting point, because the heavens can't help but glorify God. You and I, however, have a choice. Aristotle wrote that the goal to which man orders his life is happiness. And I think that if you ask your family and friends or co-workers what they hope to get out of this life, most of them, if they give that question some thoughtful consideration, would say happiness. They're not going to talk about mansions and fast cars and yachts. People want to be happy. People are ordering their lives and making decisions and chasing various pursuits after happiness. But you don't have to look very far to see that many of those roads are dead ends. People are not happy. And the reason that is the case is because God did not create us to pursue happiness. We were created to pursue God, to pursue God's own pleasure, to glorify God. Now, the wonderful thing about that is that happiness is a byproduct of glorifying God. One of my favorite Old Testament verses is Psalm 16 and verse 11. In the presence of God, he says, is the fullness of joy, and at His right hand are pleasures forevermore. We get into a big problem when we try to take secondary things and make them primary things. I hear a lot of people talk about inviting God into their life, but they've got it backwards. God has invited us into His life to enjoy Him, to participate in His life, and as we glorify Him, happiness and the biblical word joy becomes ours. C.S. Lewis said that if you take second things and make them first things, you lose them both. You've got to have them in the right order. Now, as we come to a conclusion of Act 1, the story of creation, if we're reading through the Bible, we stop at Genesis chapter 2 and we press the pause button there. And as readers, we're left kind of on this mountaintop or pinnacle of emotion. We're in awe of all that God has created. We are in awe of God Himself at His majesty and His power and His wisdom. Everything is good. Everything is very good. It's perfect. It is in its pristine state. No corruption or decay. And in Genesis chapter 2, the focus is narrowed down to one place. One garden. A paradise. And there's man, created in the image of God. Adam, the first man, and Eve, the mother of all living. The heavens are screaming out God's glory. And we as readers look in eager anticipation of what man will do. We'll pick up here next time as we begin Act 2 of the story of the Bible.